Hello, this is Fiona Cuthbertson coming to the pod to record another episode of Off the Cuff. And today we have Right Hon Mark Francois, MP, in the hot seat. Mark became the MP for Raleigh and Wickford in 2001 and has served as a Minister of Defence, as well as in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. A high-profile Brexiteer, he was Deputy Chair of the European Research Group and has also written his book, Spartan Victory, The Inside Story of the Battle of Brexit, as an inside story on the negotiations, which is available on Amazon now. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much.
It's brilliant to have you here. Firstly, can you tell us a bit about your political journey?
I suppose it all began with my father. My father, Rt Hon Francois, was born into a working class family in North London in 1925. Aged 18 in 1943, he left a reserved occupation making goggles for RAF pilots, and he joined the Royal Navy. And a year later, aged 19, Stoker First Class Rt Hon Francois was at D-Day. He was on a minesweeper called HMS Bressay. And like a lot of veterans, Fiona, he wouldn't talk about it. He'd talk about the fun side, about getting into punch-ups with the American Navy in Portsmouth, but he wouldn't talk about combat. And one night, when I would have been about 11 or 12 years of age, he came home from a naval reunion. Now, my father wasn't a big drinker, but he clearly had a few that night. And I would normally have been long to bed, but for some reason, God was kind, and I stayed up late, and I was there when he came in. And he sat down, and he just opened up. He just started to talk about what it was like on the 6th of June, 1944. And he wasn't glorying in it. There was no jingoism, utterly the opposite. He just kept speaking about how many people had died that day. And he made me promise, even as an 11 or 12-year-old, that when I grew up, I'd never, ever take living in a free country for granted. And I did. And 2 years later, when I was 14, unfortunately, completely out of the blue, he died of a heart attack in the middle of the night. This was back in 1979. And so I never forgot my promise. And I've always been interested in defence. I joined the Territorial Army during the Cold War when the war was still up. I was an infantry officer in 5 Royal Anglian, the NATO Royal Battalion. And I decided that what I wanted to do in my life was to become a member of Parliament and really focus on the defence issues. I served on Basildon Council in the early 90s. I fought Ken Livingstone in Brent East in 1997 as my sort of apprenticeship. I got selected for Raleigh in 2000 to replace a retiring Tory called Michael Clark. He'd done 18 years. Never occurred to me for a moment I'd do 25. And then came in 2001. So I came in, if you like, as a defence specialist. All the Brexit stuff came some years later.
And what's the biggest lesson you've learned as an MP?
Well, I suppose I've learned a few, but that it often takes a lot of hard work to get things done. We deal with so many quangos and bureaucrats now. When I was first elected in 2001, one letter on an MP's letterhead could get a lot done for your constituents. Now it often takes a lot longer, but you can still achieve things. On Friday, I'm hopefully sitting in the cab of a digger to break ground on the first ever special educational needs school in the Rochford district. That's been a labour of love of mine, but it's taken 3 years to get there. So you can get things done. You've just got to be really dogged and persistent to achieve it.
And you mentioned that you came in 2001. What was it like to be in opposition for the first 9 years of your time in Parliament?
Tough, but it's even tougher now. So when I came in 01, we'd suffered a heavy defeat, but there were still 166 of us. There are now 117 of us. So when the Liberals gang up with Labour, which is about 3/4 of the time, including on Northern Ireland veterans the other evening, which made me very annoyed, we're outnumbered 5-1. So as someone said to me lightheartedly, it's a bit like Rorke's Drift, but without the Victoria Crosses. So it's quite hard work holding the government to account, but nonetheless, I believe we're making a good fist of it. And gradually we're eking our way back up in the opinion polls.
Talking of opinion polls, in 2010, the Labour Party lost, but the Conservatives didn't win, so you ended up in a coalition. How did you find that change, considering it wasn't an easy alignment of political principles, as you did refer to in your book a couple of times?
Well, it was difficult. Just prior to the election, I was the shadow Europe minister. I was the number 2 in our Foreign Office team. And I'd been hoping that if we won, I'd go off to the Foreign Office, working for William Hague as the putative Foreign Secretary. A week after the election, I was back in the Whip's office handing out offices. So sometimes politics takes a path that you don't expect. By and large, the coalition worked reasonably well. We remember the country was effectively bankrupt in 2010 after all of Brown's largesse. We steadied the ship. We began to put the public finances back on an even keel. One area that does frustrate me, though, is part of that coalition deal was Nick Clegg and Danny Alexander would under no circumstances countenance work on what's known as the dreadnought class of new nuclear deterrent submarines to replace our aging Trident boats. And that cost us 5 years we didn't have. And one of those deterrent submarines came back from patrol recently after having been out for 208 days, which is double the time that they're meant to spend. So one real mistake that they made in the coalition was not to go ahead with the Dreadnought program. It's since approved. We approved it in 2016 once we'd won outright, but we lost 5 years and we're playing catch up.
You mentioned that it does have an impact on what the government can do. Do you think it had an impact on the government agenda and what you could actually maintain in your manifesto as well?
By definition, a coalition implies an element of compromise. But all the key decisions were taken by what became known as the Quad. So that was Cameron, Osborne, Nick Clegg and Danny Alexander. So you had the cabinet, but any really important, vital or politically sensitive decisions had to go through the Quad. And that often delayed decision making because you needed to get on the kind of list to have something approved by the Quad. So that slowed government up in some respects. But I still think the coalition really economically helped to steady the ship. I think it did a number of things well, but not necessarily in defence.
You did have a number of positions in the government. What was your favourite role, would you say?
After the 2010 election, I went to the Whip's office for 2 years, which I kind of enjoyed. I was the vice chairman of Her Majesty's household, which is a rather flowery title, but it meant that I got to go to some of the garden parties, and it also meant that on the day of the state opening, one MP goes to Buckingham Palace by tradition to be held hostage, as surety for the safe return of the monarch. Remember, we cut Charles I's head off, so quite rightly, they take no chances these days. And I had that privilege twice. So I was the hostage, as it's known, 2 years in a row. That was quite a special thing because you're there when Her late Majesty came down the stairs, and then you're there when she goes back up the stairs. So it's quite a thing to do. And then I went to the MOD, which was where I'd always wanted to go. I was the Veterans Minister from 12 to 13, and the Armed Forces Minister, effectively the number 2 in the department, from 13 to 15.
Coming back briefly to your time as being held hostage, is there any insider information you can tell us about what that experience was like and what actually happened?
Well, I'll tell you a little anecdote. It's light-hearted. It's a Duke of Edinburgh story, basically. So on the 2 years that I did it, on 1 year the Duke was with Her late Majesty, another year he wasn't very well, she did it on her own. The year that he was with her, so there you are, you're standing in morning dress, you've got your wand of office, which looks a bit like a thing snookered you. And I was there next to the Earl Peel, who was the Chamberlain, you're his titular deputy. And the Duke and the Queen came down the staircase of Buckingham Palace and, good morning, Your Majesty, good luck. And the Duke looked at me, and without warning, he just went, "Who are you?" I wasn't really expecting this. I was a bit flustered. Before I could think of anything to say, the Queen said with a note of slight exasperation in her voice, "He's the hostage." "Oh, yes, the hostage. Yes, jolly good." And they got into the coach and off they went, escorted by the household cavalry. So you're taken off to a side room to watch the whole thing on a flat screen TV, and your captivity begins with a coffee and a shortbread biscuit. And shall we say, conditions improve as the day wears on. So they came back after the ceremony, and there you are, and well done, Your Majesty, that went very well. And they walked past, and he stopped, And he turned on his heel, and I thought, oh God, what now? And he walked right up to me and he said, I'll bet you're bloody relieved to see us. Because I'd actually said once jokingly, I said, what happens if something goes wrong? What happens to me? And the courtier said, well, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Francois. The rules in that situation are very clear. I think it was off to Tower Hill and off with your head. So, but all in theory. So that's a very fond memory of mine. And, you know, it's for things like that that the Duke of Edinburgh was loved. And I don't think it tells any harm, really, to tell that little story, or I wouldn't do it.
Absolutely not. And coming to one of your main passions as an MP, it's always been Brexit. Mm-hmm. And what drove that?
Well, I was the Shadow Europe Minister under William Hague when we debated the Lisbon Treaty back in 2007-8, right? And we spent 14 nights going through that 300-page treaty line by line in the House of Commons. And it rapidly became apparent that you couldn't change so much as a semicolon. And when it was all over, I went out for dinner with my then researcher, a wonderful guy called Christopher Howarth, you know, who worked silly hours to help me go through the treaty and write the amendments. And I said to Chris, we've got to get out of this. We don't run our own country anymore. We've been relegated to the status of a sort of glorified parish council. So that was my epiphany, if you like. And then we got to the referendum. So I was one of a relatively small number of ministers under Cameron who decided to campaign to leave rather than remain. And then we won. And they put out a booklet. It's in my book, which you kindly plugged, called Spartan Victory. It's still available on Amazon. Thank you, Fiona. And I particularly highlighted in the book that in the run-up to the referendum, as some of your listeners might remember, the government put out a leaflet all trying to persuade us to vote Remain. And on page 13 of said leaflet, it famously said, this is your decision. The government will implement what you decide. Well, the people decided peacefully and democratically to leave. But then the government didn't implement that. And I thought this is really important, because if we don't keep our word on this, why will people ever vote again on anything else? If we can renege on something as crucial as this, then politics has had it. All trust will be gone. So I fought with some of my colleagues very hard to make sure that we actually kept the promise and that we left the EU. And it took another 3 years to do it, but we did.
And you mentioned in your book again the fact that you had to sum up one of the debates on the Lisbon Treaty, whether or not there should be a referendum. So how did it feel to be called on at such short notice, which you were?
Well, it was shorter notice than people know. I'll tell you another story. So we had the 14 nights and we left the referendum amendment to the last night, you know, because that was kind of the culmination of the debate. And it was our amendment, and William, as the Shadow Foreign Secretary, moved the amendment. Now, normally the mover of the amendment would then do a summary speech at the end. And that's when you tell the House whether you're going to press the amendment to a vote or whether you're going to withdraw. Halfway through the debate, William comes to me and he says, well, Jim Murphy, and the government's minister wants to do a sum up. And I think we should do a little summing up too. So I said, yes, William, well, you get a few minutes. No, Mark, he says, I'm not going to do it. You are. I said, what? He said, no, you're going to sum up. You've put a lot of work into this bill, so I'm going to let you sum up on the referendum. I said, we've only got 3 hours left and I haven't got a speech. He said, well, you better get writing with one. I'm off for a bowl of soup. And left me sit there on the bench. So we managed to cobble together a speech. Christopher and some others, back with Denzel Davidson, you're working in the back room, got together a speech, and then I altered it a little bit. And then I got up and delivered it. It was to a packed house. There was a lot of electricity. I mean, that's the nearest I've ever done anything that comes to Prime Minister's questions. And I argued my little heart out, and we lost the vote, but we were always going to. We split the Liberals down the middle. Some of them resigned from the front bench on a point of honour, people like Alistair Carmichael, in order to vote for a referendum. Most of the Liberals abstained. I was pretty impolite about the Liberals abstaining. I never saw the coalition coming. So a few years later, when we went into coalition, that's why I never got to the Foreign Office. That's why I was in the Whip's office handing out MPs' offices.
Having been so keen on Brexit, why did you argue about the withdrawal agreement?
Because it meant we didn't leave. When you actually read it, one of the things I learned doing the Lisbon Treaty is you had to read the small print. And the so-called withdrawal agreement, actually, when you read it, did the opposite because of something called the backstop. So when you read the fine print, it was very cleverly drafted. Tony Blair once admitted as much at a seminar. Actually, if we'd signed up for the withdrawal agreement, we would have ended up in a customs union forever, which meant that we didn't control our own trade policy, which would have meant that we never really left. And that's why I opposed it, because it was a con. And in the end, we had 3 crunch votes, the so-called meaningful votes, NV1, NV2, and NV3, as they were known. And on NV3, it came down to 28 Tory MPs who, if you like, held out to the end. And the media nicknamed us the Spartans, as in the Spartans guarding the pass at Thermopylae. And the media love a nickname. And anyway, we held out, and in the end, the withdrawal agreement was defeated. And eventually, under Boris, we negotiated the trading cooperation agreement, and we left for real in January 2020, but far longer than we should have done. And I remember night after night seeing Keir Starmer, who was the shadow DEXU minister at the time, pulling every procedural trick in the book to try and keep us in the EU at almost any price. And that man hasn't changed. Mr. Second Referendum, as he got nicknamed at the time. Keir Starmer remains a Remainer, and he always will. And what Labour are trying to do now is to take us back in by stealth.
Is this why you felt you needed to be so involved with the European Research Group? And was the group always united in its thinking?
Well, towards the end, even the ERG split. Some in the ERG thought we had to vote for it because it was the best we were going to get. Others of us, the Spartans, if you like, decided that no, we couldn't just kind of hold our nose and vote for it, because ultimately it meant that we'd stayed in, and that would have betrayed the spirit of the referendum, which we felt we couldn't do for all the reasons I've explained. But the European Research Group, I mean, that's its place in history because it did what it said on the tin. It went through this very complex gobbledygook and basically translated it into pub English so that the public could understand what was going on. And there were all these debates in Parliament about the backstop and how that would work. And it was the ERG that inspired all of that. We're the people that drew the public's and the media's attention, and then crucially MP's attention, to what this treaty actually did. So I hope we did history as service. We researched a European treaty. We explained to Parliament its real implications. And as a result, Parliament said, no, thank you. Remember, a meaningful vote won. The government lost, I think, by 149 votes. It's the biggest defeat in parliamentary history since 1265. No government had ever lost a vote that comprehensively. And you would have thought that at that point, Theresa May would have taken the hit. But no, being Theresa, she ploughed on.
There are those that say that Brexit failed because it was always going to. Those who say it failed because people didn't allow it to succeed, which is right.
And neither are right. It hasn't failed. We had the fastest vaccine rollout in the world because we didn't have to comply with all the bureaucracy of the European Health Agency. At least until last year, we were the 4th largest exporter in the world because we've got the ability to do independent trade deals now, which you can't when you're in a customs union. In a customs union, you can only negotiate through the EU. So we've had 70 new trade deals, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which gives us improved access to the fastest growing market in the world. We've been able to do all of that because we've left, and even government ministers have admitted that we couldn't have done that if we were still in the EU. So I believe it has been a success. I think COVID, obviously, we went into lockdown, 2 months after we left. So clearly that made it difficult for world trade for everybody. If we hadn't have had COVID and all the disruption that led to, I think we could have made even more progress than we have. But I still believe it's a success. But I also believe that Labour desperately want to reverse it, because Starmer and Reeves and co have never ever accepted the result of the referendum. They're not Democrats. But the British people were asked, would you like to govern yourselves? And oh my gosh, they had the temerity to say they would. And some people have never been able to accept that, including Keir Starmer and Rachel Reid.
I was going to come back to Keir Starmer regarding the fact that it is quite obvious that he does want to reverse Brexit. So what do you think should be done now to get some level of stability on this issue?
Well, here's what the government are going to do. In fact, they started to do it. They won't dare risk another referendum. So they're going to try and do it via grandmother's footsteps. So we have this process that's called dynamic alignment. What that means in English is that we sign up in certain sectors. And at the moment, we're talking about the regulation of some elements of farming and veterinary practice. And we're going to sign up to follow automatically EU rules in those areas. So if the EU issue a new directive or a regulation, we automatically copy them, regardless of the will of Parliament. And they're trying to get that through at the moment. Now, if they get that through, then they'll pick another sector, maybe motor vehicles. And then if they get that through, they'll pick another sector and another and another. And it'll be a bit like salami slicing our sovereignty, sector by sector. It's like boiling a frog. The frog never quite leaps out because it doesn't realise it's being boiled. And this is what they're going to try and pull on the British people. And they think we're not going to notice. Well, they're wrong. And there are still a lot of us in Parliament who understand this stuff. And we're going to start screaming this from the rooftops. And the fact that I've said this on your podcast is part of that process.
Absolutely. And the screaming starts here. So that's all good. So coming to your other area of expertise, we're living in a very uncertain world. How can the UK better defend itself?
Well, I've always believed, for the reasons I said at the start, because of Dad and all of that, I've always believed, Fiona, in that old maxim that the first duty of government, above all others, is the defence of the realm. And as you say, the world is becoming a more dangerous place. We now have two wars going, one in Ukraine, one in Iran. And I believe we should substantially increase our defence spending, because history shows what happens if we don't. And there was an old Roman military theorist called Vegetus who said the Latin quotation is civis pacem para bellum. He who desires peace should prepare for war in order to deter it. So we have said, Kemi said a year ago, that we should increase our defence spending to 3% of GDP by the end of this Parliament. Labour still won't commit to that. They talk about substantial increases in defence, but they won't put hard dates on it. And in financial year 25-26, they've instituted cuts in the operations budget in day-to-day MOD spending of £2.6 billion, which in the current strategic climate is madness. So they're running the MOD a bit like trying to manage a business for cash. They're trying to do everything they can to forestall any outlay, to delay whatever they can delay. And history shows that's often a false economy. So should we be bolstering our defences? Yes. Should we be spending more money with the defence industry, particularly with British industry? Yes, we should. Should we be increasing the size of the army? Yes. And we announced that if we were to come into government, we would bring back the two-child benefit cap. That saves about £3.2 billion in a full year. We'd use half of that money under our golden rule to reduce debt, and the other 1.6 billion we'd use for defence, principally to increase the regular army back to 80,000 and the reserves from 20,000 to 40,000. So we'd have an army on mobilisation of 120,000. That's quite a big increase. And there's a concrete example of how we should do it.
You mentioned the two wars that are going on at the moment. Obviously, we haven't actually put boots on the ground. So do you think we can have an impact on the world stage without that?
Well, we backed the Ukrainians to the hilt. And I was in Ukraine with a delegation of some 20 other British MPs, all party, to show support for the Ukrainians. We were there principally to be part of the commemoration of the 4th anniversary of the Russian full-scale invasion, which took place in the Maidan Square in the centre of Kyiv on the 24th of February. They have a ceremony, whereas here we lay a wreath, they lay a small lantern with a candle, but it's the same principle. And it's the Ukrainian equivalent of Remembrance Sunday, and we were there and paid our respects. So we in Britain have been backing Ukrainians since 2014, when Russia first invaded the Crimea and the Donbass. The Ukrainians pointed out to us very clearly on that trip, they've not been at war with Russia for 4 years, they've been at war with Russia for 12 since 2014. That's longer than the First and Second World Wars put together. And we had a debate about Ukraine in the Commons the following day on the 25th. And I travelled back from Kyiv overnight with no sleep for 17 hours to sum up for the opposition in that debate and then to relay to the House the key findings of our trip in Ukraine. And a colleague said, you spoke with real gravitas. I said, that's very kind of you, but I was actually speaking slowly so as not to slur my words and fall asleep, is the truth. So we've backed the Ukrainians to the hilt for 12 years in Britain. I think we can be very proud of that. And we should have allowed the Americans to use the runways, including, ironically, at Diego Garcia, because, again, that was designed partly to stop Iran developing a nuclear weapons capability, which, if they did, would be a threat to certainly to the region and indeed to the wider world.
And how do you feel that the UK needs to collaborate with other countries?
Well, we were one of the founder members of NATO. It's arguably the most successful defensive alliance in history, but it's under strain. And one of the things that really worries me about the current situation with regards to Iran is when you see Trump referring to Starmer as he ain't no Winston Churchill. Well, I could have told him that for free. But the Anglo-American relationship, the so-called special relationship, however you want to characterize it, that relationship between London and Washington is the absolute fulcrum of NATO. If that relationship goes badly wrong, the rest of NATO goes wrong. And I'm worried that because of some of Starmer's decisions, that relationship is now in jeopardy. And that's a really serious thing for our security, for NATO's security, and indeed ultimately for America's security too. So it's going to take a while to repair the damage to the Anglo-American relationship that Starmer has done.
We have local elections coming up. Do you think defence and Brexit are going to impact the results?
Well, a lot of people might have thought not, but if we just look at defence, for instance, first, every few months the pollsters run these polls that say, what are the most important issues facing Britain in your opinion? And defence historically has struggled even to get into the top 10. The last set of polling, it was fourth. So clearly, with all the events in Ukraine, now Iran, people are becoming rightfully more concerned about their security and the safety of themselves and their families. So I think defence could, for the first time in some years, be an issue in May in a way that perhaps it hasn't been for some time. And the question is, are there politicians going to respond positively and do something about it? I've given you some examples of what the Tory party's announced in recent weeks. We're still waiting in Parliament for something called the Defence Investment Plan, the DIP, which is the 10-year equipment plan for the armed forces. It's now 8 months late. We were promised it in the autumn. We were faithfully promised it by Christmas. The reason they can't publish it is because the Treasury and the MOD just cannot agree on how much to spend on defence. It's as simple as that. And Reeves keeps vetoing it. And because of that, there are 2 wars going on, and we can't even tell our people how we're going to re-equip the armed forces over the next 10 years, because we've got a Labour government that can't take a decision to save their blooming lives.
What about those who say that we should be concentrating on what's going on within our own borders as opposed to getting involved in other people's wars?
I think we need both. We need to look to our own security, but we need to do that with our allies. NATO has been historically the most successful defensive alliance in history. We don't want to throw that away. So I think we need to work hard at our international relationships, also with France and Germany and other NATO partners. But somehow we've got to repair this breach with the United States, because Vladimir Putin, looking at that, will be rubbing his hands.
And of course, we are now much less of a two-party politics system with reform making inroads. Do you think that that's going to be reversed, or do you think that that trend is actually going to continue through the local election?
No, I think politics is now a very kind of crowded, competitive space. But one of the things that worries me about reform, and I don't want to sound like a one-club golfer here, is they've announced a shadow cabinet, so-called. I call it the drinks cabinet, but a shadow cabinet with no defence spokesman in it. So I don't take, until they do that, I don't take it seriously. If defence of the realm is the most important duty of government, and I believe it is, they haven't got a defence spokesman. I said to one of them once, who is your defence spokesman? He said, it's whoever turns up on the day. Well, most often on the day, no one turns up. Time and again, we've debated defence in the Commons, and no Reform MP is even in the chamber, let alone says anything. Nigel Farage had a question for defence questions, he didn't even turn up. So if Reform want to be a serious party of government, they've got to start behaving like one, and that means having a defence spokesman.
And finally, where do you think we'll be in 5 years' time?
My old friend Sir David Amess, he was my best mate in Parliament, Fiona. He was murdered by an Islamistic extremist. When I did my tribute to my eulogy in Parliament, I summed him up as quite simply the best bloke I ever knew. And I still stand by that. And I really miss him, if I'm honest. And he always cautioned me to be cautious about predicting the results of elections too far in advance. He used to say, Mark, it's always best to comment on elections when you've had them and you know who won. But if what lies behind your question is, do I think that we could win the next general election? Yeah, I think we could. But we've got a hell of a lot of work to do, because Reform are now slipping back in the polls. We're now edging forward. In most of the opinion polls in the last few months, we've been second. If we could get one where we were first, that'd be pretty good. But Labour seem to be slipping back. In a lot of polls, they're now fourth behind the Greens. So I'll chance my arm a little bit. I think Labour are going to do very badly in May. And then we'll see what effect that has on Sir Keir Starmer afterwards. You see the comrades on a Wednesday at Prime Minister's Questions, they're not happy. So we'll see what happens.
Indeed. Mark, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. It's been really interesting to hear about your journey and how defence and Brexit, as much as it seems that those things are just about helping people abroad, they are actually fundamental to our democracy. And thank you to the viewers who've hopefully enjoyed the show as much as we've enjoyed making it. If you have any questions about the podcast today, please feel free to comment. And if you think it's worth coming back, please like and subscribe. And if you want to buy Mark's book, Spartan Victory, it is at Amazon, as is Party Games, by me. And on that note, I'll hope you have a good week, one and all.